The mansion had stood on the hill for as long as anyone in town could remember. A crumbling relic of another time, its once grand structure was now draped in ivy and shadows, its towering spires piercing the sky like skeletal fingers. No one dared go near it, not even the bravest teenagers looking for a thrill. Rumors swirled about disappearances, strange noises, and windows that seemed to glow with an eerie light despite the fact that no one had lived there for decades. I had always been fascinated by it. Maybe it was my love for the unknown, or maybe it was the way the town spoke about the mansion in hushed tones, as if merely mentioning it would invite misfortune. Whatever the reason, I knew I had to see it for myself. It was on a cold autumn evening when I finally decided to go. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, and the wind howled through the trees as if whispering warnings. My flashlight flickered as I approached the rusted gate, which stood slightly ajar as if inviting me inside. I hesitated for a moment, my pulse quickening. The place felt alive, not in the way a home does, but in the way something unnatural lurks just beyond the veil of comprehension. I stepped forward, the crunch of dead leaves beneath my boots unnaturally loud. The path leading up to the mansion was overgrown, and the stone steps were cracked and uneven. With every step, I felt the weight of unseen eyes watching me. I told myself it was just my imagination, just the product of too many ghost stories and late-night horror movies. But deep down, I knew better. The front door loomed ahead, weathered and splintered, its brass knocker tarnished with age. I reached out, running my fingers over the cold metal before pushing the door open. It groaned in protest, revealing a darkened hallway beyond. The smell of dust and decay hit me immediately, thick and suffocating. The air inside was colder than it should have been, as if the house itself had been frozen in time. My flashlight beam danced across the grand foyer. A massive chandelier hung above, its crystals coated in cobwebs. Portraits lined the walls, their painted eyes following me as I stepped inside. The faces were unfamiliar, yet something about them unsettled me. The silence was oppressive, so absolute that even my own breathing seemed deafening. I moved further in, my footsteps echoing on the marble floor. A grand staircase curled upward into darkness, its wooden banister warped with age. I considered going up but decided to explore the lower level first. As I passed by a doorway leading into what looked like a parlor, something moved in the corner of my vision. I spun around, flashlight trembling in my grip. Nothing, just shadows stretching along the walls. My heart pounded against my ribs, but I forced myself to keep moving. The furniture was draped in white sheets, their ghostly shapes adding to the sense of unease. A piano sat in the corner, its lid closed, its keys long untouched. Yet, as I turned away, a single note played, a deep, mournful sound that sent a chill down my spine. I froze. The logical part of my brain told me it was just the house settling, a trick of acoustics, but the deeper, more primal part of me screamed that I was not alone. Something was here, and it had just noticed me. I stood frozen. My breath caught in my throat as the echo of the piano key faded into the suffocating silence. My flashlight trembled slightly in my grip, the beam flickering across the dust-choked air. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn around, to leave the mansion before whatever was inside realized I had overstayed my welcome. But something stronger, curiosity, or perhaps something far more reckless, kept my feet planted where they were. Swallowing hard, I forced myself to take another step forward. The floorboards groaned beneath me, the sound unnervingly like a sigh, as if the house itself was exhaling at my intrusion. The air inside was thick, heavy, and carried a strange scent, a mixture of damp wood, mildew, and something metallic, like old blood. I moved toward the grand staircase, my fingers grazing the banister. The wood was oddly smooth, untouched by time, unlike the decayed state of everything else around it. That was the first thing that felt wrong. The second was the way the darkness at the top of the stairs seemed unnaturally deep, as if the shadows there were alive, waiting for me to step closer. A sudden creak behind me sent a jolt of fear through my spine. I spun around, my flashlight sweeping across the room, illuminating dust motes suspended in the air. The sheets draped over the furniture remained undisturbed, the piano untouched. And yet I knew I had heard something. "Hello?" My voice came out in a whisper, barely audible, as if I was afraid to speak too loudly. No response. I swallowed hard and forced myself to move again, stepping cautiously toward a doorway that led deeper into the mansion. The hallway beyond was long and narrow, lined with doors on either side. The wallpaper peeled away in jagged strips, revealing rotting wood beneath. My footsteps felt too loud in the silence. The kind of silence that made you feel like something was holding its breath, waiting. I stopped in front of the first door on my right. The brass handle was cold to the touch, and for a brief moment, I considered turning back. But the thought of leaving without answers felt worse than the fear pressing against my ribs. I twisted the handle and pushed the door open. The room inside was small, filled with broken furniture and scattered papers. A massive bookshelf stood against one wall, its shelves bowing under the weight of forgotten books. A single window, cracked and fogged with age, allowed a faint sliver of moonlight to filter in. The moment I stepped inside, the door behind me swung shut with a force that rattled the walls. I spun around, my heart slamming against my ribs. My flashlight flickered, the beam sputtering as if struggling to stay alive. I rushed back to the door, grabbing the handle and twisting hard. It wouldn't budge. Panic began to creep in, but before I could fully succumb to it, something shifted behind me. A soft rustling sound, like fabric brushing against the floor. I turned slowly, my breath shallow. At first, I saw nothing but the darkness pooled in the corners of the room. But then, from the depths of the shadows, something moved. A shape, barely distinguishable from the blackness itself, stood near the bookshelf. My flashlight flickered again, and for a split second, I saw a glimpse of it. A figure wrapped in tattered, flowing fabric, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. I couldn't breathe. It didn't move toward me, didn't make a sound. It only stood there, watching. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The door behind me creaked open. But I couldn't move. My feet felt rooted to the dust-covered floor. My breath shallow as I stared at the empty space where the figure had been just moments ago. The room felt different now. Heavier, as if the walls had drawn closer, suffocating me in their silent embrace. My flashlight flickered again, its weak beam struggling to push back the darkness that now felt alive. A sudden gust of air rushed past me, cold and sharp, like icy fingers trailing down my spine. The bookshelf rattled, books tumbling onto the floor, as if something unseen had brushed against them. I forced myself to move, stumbling backward toward the open doorway, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. As soon as I crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. I spun around, my flashlight trembling in my grip. The door, which had seemed so old and weak, now looked impenetrable. No amount of pushing or pulling would open it again. A whisper, faint, almost too soft to hear, but unmistakable. It came from the darkened hallway ahead of me. Not a single voice, but many, overlapping, murmuring, their words just out of reach. My skin prickled with a deep, primal fear. I turned, desperate to find a way out, but the mansion had changed. The hallway, which had been narrow and lined with doors, now stretched endlessly in both directions, the walls shifting, twisting. I blinked, trying to steady my breath, but my surroundings wouldn't stop shifting. Doors melted away into the darkness, and the ceiling seemed to stretch higher, swallowed by shadows. I was no longer in the same house I had entered. The whispers grew louder. My pulse pounded as I took a cautious step forward, my boots sinking slightly into the dust-covered floor. The air smelled strange, like burning wood and something sickly sweet, something rotten. A soft thud echoed behind me. I spun around, my flashlight barely catching the edge of movement. Something had fallen in the distance, but I didn't want to know what. Then came the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, not mine. I held my breath, the beam of my flashlight darting across the hallway. The shadows shifted unnaturally, shapes forming and dissolving before I could focus on them. My body screamed at me to run, but the air around me felt thick, almost as if the mansion itself didn't want me to leave. The footsteps grew closer, and then I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, where the shadows were deepest, something was moving. The first thing I noticed were the eyes. 2 pinpricks of dull, yellow light staring directly at me. The figure was tall, impossibly thin, its limbs elongated and drawn. Its head tilted slightly, as if observing me with curiosity. My breath hitched as it took a step forward, and then another. The floor beneath me groaned as I took a step back, my legs weak, shaking. The figure did not rush. It did not need to. There was something far more terrifying in its slow, methodical movements, as if it had all the time in the world. I turned and ran. The hallway twisted around me, the walls narrowing and expanding, the doors disappearing as I passed them. My own footsteps echoed back at me, but they were not alone. Something else was running too, faster, closing the distance between us. I didn't dare look back. A door appeared ahead of me, slightly ajar. Without thinking, I lunged for it, throwing myself inside and slamming it shut behind me. My back pressed against the cold wood, my chest heaving. Silence, but only for a moment. Then slowly, something pressed against the other side of the door. Not hands, not fists, something larger, heavier. The wood creaked, the hinges groaning under the weight. A deep guttural sound rumbled from the other side, something between a growl and a breath. And then the whisper returned, not from the hallway, from inside the room with me. The whisper slithered through the darkness, curling around me like cold fingers. It was close, too close. My skin prickled as I slowly turned my flashlight toward the room, my breath shallow, my hands shaking. The beam cut through the thick dust-filled air, revealing a space that shouldn't exist. It was larger than the room I had entered, the walls stretching impossibly far into the shadows. There was no furniture, no windows, just an expanse of emptiness, except for the figure standing in the center. My stomach twisted. It wasn't the same entity I had seen in the hallway. This one was different, smaller, almost human in shape, but its face was obscured, shifting in and out of focus, like a smudged reflection in a broken mirror. The whispering grew louder, no longer just background noise, but a chorus of voices, pleading, warning, weeping. I took a step back, pressing myself against the door. The moment my body made contact, the whispers stopped. Silence. A pressure built in the air, an unbearable weight, as if something massive was pressing down on the entire mansion. My ears rang, my head throbbed, and then the door behind me flew open. I tumbled backward into the hallway, gasping, but I didn't have time to think. I scrambled to my feet and ran. The air around me vibrated with something unseen, something shifting behind the walls. The hallway twisted again, the ceiling stretching high above me, the floor warping under my steps. I didn't know where I was going, I just knew I had to move. A doorway appeared ahead, wide open. Without hesitation, I lunged for it. As soon as I crossed the threshold, the mansion's ghost screamed. A deep, agonized wail erupted from the walls, the floors, the very air around me. I stumbled into another room, slamming the door shut behind me. My pulse pounded in my ears as I braced against the wood, listening. The scream faded, but something worse replaced it. Footsteps, not slow anymore. Running, charging, coming straight for me. I turned, desperate to find another exit. This room was different, filled with old broken paintings lining the walls. Their frames were warped, the images inside distorted, faces twisted in expressions of agony. In the center of the room stood a massive mirror, cracked from top to bottom. It was the only thing that looked untouched by time. And then I saw my reflection. It wasn't me. The figure staring back had my clothes, my flashlight, my posture, but the face wasn't mine. It was pale, hollow-eyed, and grinning. Not in a way that suggested amusement, but something far worse, something hungry. The footsteps outside grew closer. I didn't have time to think. The door behind me rattled violently, and I ran straight at the mirror. The moment my fingers touched the glass, the world shattered. A cold, suffocating darkness swallowed me whole. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was something deeper, something alive. I tried to move, but I had no body, no form. I was drifting, sinking, being sea-pulled. Then, suddenly, I fell. My body slammed onto solid ground, the impact knocking the air from my lungs. I gasped, blinking against the sudden light. I was outside. The mansion loomed behind me, untouched, unbothered. The sky above was an eerie shade of gray, the air thick with silence. I turned, heart still hammering, expecting to see the front door standing open behind me. It was closed. Had it ever been open? I took a shaky breath, stepping back. My entire body ached, my mind scrambled for an explanation. But deep down, I knew one thing for certain. I hadn't escaped. The mansion had let me go, and it was only a matter of time before it called me back.